Welcome, everybody. I am Jake McKenzie, the president and CEO at Intermark Group, the nation's largest psychology-driven marketing firm. And with me, as always, is Dr. David Bridwell, our chief people scientist. David has a PhD in psychology and is going to bring a lot of insights into how our topic today can be viewed through the prism of affecting consumers and their psychology. So today's topic is clearly provocative. Does advertising work? And this goes back a couple of months when a friend of mine who was a CEO at a pretty significant company said, hey, there's a podcast you need to listen to. And it was, of course, the Freakonomics podcast from the end of last year. And you're familiar with Freakonomics from their awesome books. They use data-driven research methodologies to question a lot of our basic assumptions about things we thought we understood. And in this podcast, they looked at some research that raised the provocative question, does advertising really work like we think it works, or are people spending too much money and wasting money at it? I don't know about you, but this caused quite a stir in my world. After she brought it up, I had several more people raise the question and wanted to know what's going on. So today's topic is really to dive into that and give us a construct using their research, which is valid, but come to some slightly different conclusions, how you can apply it to our business and your business to get better outcomes. So let's dive in. As always, we're going to start with a little bit about Intermark. As you likely know, we're the nation's largest psychology-driven marketing firm, and we help companies achieve better outcomes by applying the behavioral sciences. And we've been privileged to do this with some of the biggest, best, and most fun brands across America, both in the business to consumer space, as well as the business to business space. And what they all have in common is they were interested in demonstrable growth. Now, logistically, we are a marketing firm and we perform all of the services one might expect from digital and social media and video production and TV ads and media buying and all the things under that sun. We're headquartered out of Birmingham and we have offices in Atlanta and Tampa. All right, now with the about us out of the way, let's dive into the topic at hand. Does advertising work? And we've got a construct we want to walk you through today to share some of that research from Freakonomics and discuss it in terms of phases of growth for different businesses. Then we want to apply it to you. How do we get that balancing act between branding and immediate sales that we're all wrestling with? And then understanding how it works on a psychological level and how we can apply it to get better outcomes. And the principles here are straightforward. Number one, stay present. Number two, build a brand, and that means going deep. And number three, getting a greater share of mind. Now, we're going to dive into these in much greater depth to share with you quite a bit of research. But of course, we want to start out with the question at hand. What was it Freakonomics shared that got everybody so stirred up? Well, if you've listened to their podcast, they covered two different studies in this, and both of them were fairly provocative. The first one came from our friends at eBay. I know you're all familiar with eBay, but they went through a weird scenario where they were running search ads and then suddenly stopped. So the way it worked is they were running ads, they got clicks. They were running ads, they got clicks. And all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, their ads went dark. Well, what happened? Nothing. In fact, they kept getting clicks. Their sales stayed the same as they were before. And once they turned them back on, the sales didn't go back up. And that caused them to go, oh, wait a minute. Are we wasting money in pay-per-click ads? And eBay eventually stopped doing or cut their ad budget and have only dipped their toe back into the water as they found other ways to grow. It raises a provocative question, are they and are we wasting money? Now, the second study they covered was equally as provocative, and it had to do with how some advertisers spend money, and that gave them a nice way to do an experimental condition. They looked in markets where advertisers were spending money, and they compared those to adjacent markets, with the theory being that the populations would look very similar in the adjacent markets where they didn't run ads, and they compared the effects. The theory being that you would see much greater sales effects in the markets where you ran ads. And what they found is there weren't very pronounced effects. In the markets where they were running ads, they only saw a very mild increase in sales, on average about a 1% increase. And that's pretty shocking, right, David?
Yeah, I mean, we were expecting something on the order of 10 to 15% increase in sales with 100% increase in ad spend. So to find 1%, again, you got to step back and say, what's going on? Why is this happening? So you're starting out, you're thinking like this is what my reality looks like. Pretty
And that's what
painful.
generated all the phone calls, at least in my direction. It was CEOs and other C-suite folks going, wait a minute, are we really getting an ROI from our ad spend? How do I put this in context, or am I just wasting money? Because that's the dread fear of every non-marketing CEO I've ever met, because I don't really understand how it works. So wanted to take this research and put it into context, because I tell you, Freakonomics doesn't share research that's not valid. And it has to do with the phases of business growth. Now, companies will go through 3 phases of growth. You're in startup mode, you're just getting started, nobody knows who you are, what your products are, and you're really heavily sales focused. After you get some traction, you go through a growth phase and you're working on distribution and expanding that sales network. And after you're really successful and you get larger, you enter into a mature stage of business where everybody knows who you are and what it is that you do, and your sales and marketing takes on a different tenor with goal sets. Now, the easy answer here is that every company they looked at was in the mature stage of growth. And what we will see is that the goals for a mature growth stage company are very different. They're not worried about growing the next day sales because they have something different going on that's powering that sales. Now, what is it, David?
Yeah. So, they looked at the hundreds of largest brands. They were all running TV commercials. And when you get to be one of the biggest brands, your big priority is to keep your market share. So you're this big train going along the tracks and you have all this momentum, and your advertising is maintaining that momentum. You're maintaining your brand image for people so that you stay on their minds. So the first thing to know is that you're going to just see a decline in ROI and a decline in spend when you stop advertising after a period of time, because you've built up all of that momentum.
And branding takes a while to change momentum. It both takes a little bit to build, but it also takes a little bit once you stop doing it to see that momentum slow. And that's really what we're seeing in those studies, is that sales weren't an overnight change because they had different goals in mind. They're worried about building brand equity, becoming preferred, as well as and maintaining market share, as well as driving margin. Good advertising builds over a long period of time.
And the phrase build is really important because that is what it's about. It's a piece of the infrastructure, just as important as the other assets of your business, like the infrastructure of your business. It is actually worth money. And that's why it's called brand equity. And that's why it's a brand asset. And we know for Coca-Cola, for example, that the value that they have in their logo and their brand is comparable to the value that they have in their physical assets, because it's so powerful to have that psychological connection.
That's right. In fact, some accountants will tell you that goodwill is, in essence, your brand value, the overall non tangible piece that we feel about people. And it's really reflected in where sales come from. Sales, when we think about sales activation, represents kind of the tip of the iceberg. It does drive sales. Salespeople can be effective and sales activity can be effective. But in mature companies, the bulk of their growth comes from their overall brand value. People knowing who you are, liking who you are, and having an established mental space for you in their brain.
Yeah, and sales activation is the tip of the iceberg here because it's the bit that you see. It's the bit that's easiest to see and to measure. And it's really hard to see that big impact that brand has, but it's that thing that's extending out into the ocean and holding everything up in the first place.
And so those companies in the startup phase, they're on the water, but they're a little ice cube and they float almost entirely above the water. Everything is driven by sales because there is no brand value in this metaphor. So, how do we take this and put this into a larger construct? One simple chart can convey just about everything we want to get across today. And that's when we do sales activation. And these are things like salespeople out visiting trade shows, doing sampling and things like that that are very retail oriented. They do have an effect on sales, but it's a short-term effect on sales. They're non-recursive. Now, brand building, on the other hand, particularly when you start out, has a very modest effect and it takes a long time to build. But over time, the effect of brand will dwarf everything we do from a sales activation standpoint. Now, the punchline of this is when you're an early stage growth business, you got to lean hard on sales. As you become a much more mature company, that sales efforts will be dwarfed by the brand effect. It will create the phone ringing without your salespeople having to be out and knock on the doors and say, let me introduce you to my company, because they know who you are. You're already on the list for purchase.
Right. You have to assess where you're at. And really, that's what we want to dive into today is how can you make this transition from that initial thing where you're going to that one where you've got that sustained growth? Because there is a way to do it, and it takes some careful thought.
So we take a look at where companies go through these phases. A startup type businesses we're all familiar with. You're trying to get somebody to buy product from you at all, just initiate trial. And so the things you do in marketing are very sales oriented. Please buy from me. Let's do some sampling, try things out. I'll give you a discount. And you're slowly beginning to establish a brand. But a brand at that stage are things like a logo and a website. And you begin to answer the question, why you? But it's less important than being aware that we exist. If you do some active marketing, it's around awareness. As you enter into that next phase of growth, the growth phase, your goals change. You're trying to expand distribution. You know you're going to stay in business. And that means increased sales, but also loyalty is your main area of focus. That means for a marketing role, we begin to actually build a brand. Why us in this marketplace of competition? And you begin to mix brand along with your active sales techniques. Now, one thing to note, as we enter into different phases of business, we rarely revisit what got us here. I'm sure you've heard the famous book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. That's going to be the story here because the tactics that work in startup phase begin to diminish effects in growth phase, and they really diminish as we enter into this last phase of business, which is the mature phase of business. We know that you're maintaining market share, you're trying to get customer affinity, we want people to like us, and we also know that that helps drive a price premium. And that's a big piece of being in a mature phase business. So all those studies you saw had to do with companies that were in a mature phase of business. They weren't trying to drive next day sales. They were trying to keep their market share and to keep the price premiums that they had established. And they were very effective in doing that. Now, from a marketing role, this means you begin to do more mass marketing, talking to lots of people and less about loyalty. And this is a major lesson we want to focus on today, continuing to do mass communications and less about loyalty. And this may prove a touch controversial at first until you see the research. Because when you communicate to a large audience, we get much better effects.
Yeah, so we want to think about, what is it that makes advertising work in the first place? How do we get this connection between showing up on TV screens and billboards and creating messaging to somebody purchasing a product on the shelves or online? So we need to understand how people operate. And the first important thing to keep in mind is that we rarely actively think about brands. We wake up in the morning, we have all our personal things that we need to think about and our personal tasks that we need to take care about. This is not how we wake up in the morning. We don't think about Geico the first thing, even though that is a kind of cute little looking lizard. It looks a little bit more like this. This is a bit how I wake up in the morning, is mostly blank, empty thoughts until I've had a cup of coffee about half hour later.
That's right. And it's important to remember that people only think about your company or product or service tiny little bit of time. And so it's important that we are pre-programming the brain to be effective during that tiny little window that we're going to refer to as a trigger point.
Yeah, you're going to need to be efficient and maintain top of mind for people. And basically, the notion that they go about their lives thinking about how themselves and how they can operate in the world, it contributes to this distribution of how the way people buy products. So if you plot the number of purchases by the number of people, you end up with a curve that looks like this across categories and market shares. And it's very consistent because it's based on human behavior. So what we see in the very large bar on the left is a large number of people, and then on the bottom, a very small number of purchases. And this is how it always pans out, is that you have a large number of people purchasing a small amount of your product. When we look at the people buying a huge amount of your product, it's much less. Now think about when you first start to find growth as a company. What does that start to look like? Does it come from one place or another? It turns out it will come from the people who are buying a small amount of your product, that large number of people. That's where growth initially begins.
And this sometimes is fairly controversial. Like I hear CEOs and particularly salespeople say, no, most of our growth is coming from our good customers. We got to take care of the guy who's in our store every day or buys lots of product. But statistically, that's not true. The bulk of your growth is coming from one-time or small frequency purchases. And you may be saying, no, 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 Jake, this doesn't apply to my industry. Well, guess what? Yes, yes, it does. Every single industry we've looked at finds this same sort of distribution.
Yeah, and it also applies to new product releases too, because it is a fundamental aspect of human behavior. And you can look at it here. If we look at chocolate bars, we see this. This is 5 different chocolate bars showing the same distribution across different market shares. And here's data looking at detergents and purchases based on the number of shoppers. You see the same pattern across these separate categories.
And the same pattern exists in B2B space. It exists in service-based businesses. In just about every category we've ever looked at, you get a very similar distribution pattern. So this has major implications for how we ought to go about marketing. It means that we need a mass communication strategies as opposed to a retention strategy. We fall into the era of thinking that the bulk of our focus is going to be from our best customers, and that's simply not true. And this has to do with something called the egocentricity bias.
Yeah, the egocentricity bias in psychology, we think that others care about us much more than they actually do. And we notice ourselves much more personally because that's who we are. Other people don't notice us as much. And so that's true for your brand. If you're working for a company like eBay and you wake up in the morning, first thing you think about is eBay because you work for them. But that's not the case for the customers.
I hope most CEOs are thinking that their employees are thinking about their brand first thing in the morning.
For sure.
The reality is,
go to bed at night.
Consumers are only thinking about us a little bit. And now we know statistically the bulk of our competition or the bulk of our sales are coming from a sliver of people that are doing business with us only occasionally. And know that window of opportunity, that trigger point of when they're thinking about us is tiny. And so our goal is to nudge them, to get them to think about us and our brand at the moment they are considering being at an entry point.
Yeah, the key thing here is being salient. So you need to be there. You need to show up in a repeated way. So not just this short burst of showing up for a short time, but make sure it's extended out so that you're going to be there for these light buyers as they go about their lives.
Yeah, and that's what branding does. You begin to pre-program your brain so that you are mentally present before they get to that trigger point. So when they are at that trigger point, they think about you. And that's fundamentally why branding works. And so one of the major lessons here is be present to a large audience as opposed to a narrow audience. Now, sometimes this can be controversial. I personally know of several companies that think, no, we got to take care of our best customers. Let's advertise to them. But when you look at the research is pretty clear. When you focus just on loyalty, i.e. to your best customers, it'll drive a little bit of growth. But when you focus on penetration, talking to lots of people, even outside of your core market, it drives dramatically more growth, over 300% more. And even if we try to do both, it still doesn't work as well as when we're trying to talk to the mass audience. The reason this is because when you're talking to the mass audience, you're still talking to your best customers. They hear you. You're still getting that branding effect, but you also get the branding effect shown from people who haven't done business with you yet, or people that are only occasionally doing business with you. And as you saw, that's where growth is coming from.
Yeah, they come along for the ride. And this is really highlighted by this study where they looked at advertising award winners based on how effectiveness of the campaigns, grouped by is their goal penetration or is their goal loyalty? The gold award winners, 21% of them were looking at penetration. And that's also the case for silver and bronze, that the majority of goals of these campaigns was focused on penetration. Now take a look there in the campaigns that didn't win a medal. The majority of them are actually focused on loyalty.
That's right. And I know this can be somewhat controversial. I know you're looking at your core market going, no, most of our sales come from the senior market that eats at our restaurant on a regular basis. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You engage in loyalty type behavior, you only talk to them, and you're not pulling in the other audience that would drive growth. So as we learn from other studies, it's a major marketing lesson. You want to go penetration as your goal, to talk to a mass audience of everybody that might buy your product, as opposed to talking to the narrow audience of people that are buying your product.
Yeah, and the fact that so many of these campaigns are focusing on loyalty as a goal, despite this sort of evidence, kind of shows how much we can get trapped into thinking that would be one of the primary drivers for growth.
That's exactly right.
So let's think now about memory formation. So what's happening when we stay present and when we penetrate to make sure that these light buyers are repeatedly seeing our product? This is about creating associations with their memories and their existing memories so that they think about us and that they see us when they're at the retail store and when we're online and they see our brand.
So, how do we think about this? Well, it has to do with how the brain makes decisions. As you probably know, if you've seen some of our prior work, the brain has two decision making systems. There's system one and system two, as Dr. Daniel Kahneman described in his Nobel Prize winning research. System two is that piece of the brain that economists always told us about. It's the rational side, but the bulk of the decisions are made in this other side that's automated. And it's a side that happens without your knowledge or permission. And it's the side that we're trying to program with branding so that we get messaging, positioning messaging into your brain so that when you reach that trigger point, that small window when we're thinking about the category at all, they go, oh, this is the company that does blank. I want to think about them during this tiny window that I'm going to think about things.
Let's take a look at this ad, which really highlights this in an interesting way.
Wow, wow, no cow. No, 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 wow, wow, no cow. No, 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 wow, wow.
Now, when you see this ad, you probably thought, hey, did I see that on the Super Bowl? And you did. And I got a lot of questions about why are they advertising on the Super Bowl? Shouldn't they be talking to vegetarians and vegans or health conscious consumers that they could target more cheaply in other areas? Aha, we've just remembered the lesson we just covered. Talk to a mass audience, not a loyalty driven audience. And they did so in a highly creative way so that they will be there when that trigger point occurs.
They built a really strong brand asset. Actually, I think this is kind of one of the most smartest commercials of the Super Bowl because this asset that they made, this sound, is something that they can use throughout their subsequent advertisements. And when people hear it, they instantly can be reminded of it, and they have that instant mental memory, those memory associations with it. So basically, this is probably going to be me many years from now.
Wow, wow, no cow. No, no, no.
Just get stuck in our minds, and we know that there's many kind of jingles like that that hang around for years or a decade in people's minds.
At the rate I'm going gray, man, I think that might be next month.
I think you thought this was you first. You're like, oh man, Dave's trying to get at me here. Actually, but okay, but it's not necessarily true that this is gonna stay in people's minds, right? It showed up on the Super Bowl that one time. You need to continue to be present and continue to maintain that memory structure.
The reason that is the case is because memory fades. Now, we see this show up in another set of data, which shows that market share is directly related to share of voice. Now, it's so directly related, there's a linear relationship that every 10 points of share of voice you get, you're going to gain an immediate half point of market share, which can be worth dramatically more than the media that it costs you to get share of voice. Now, we used to talk about share of voice solely in terms of media. How much were you paying in terms of paid media? Now we talk about effective share of voice. You can achieve share of voice through social media, through earned media, public relations, and just general buzz, how much people are talking about. And thus, another phenomenon bubbles to the surface, the importance of the quality of our creative, of our buzz building, because that allows us to achieve a mass market. And we see the same notion of share of voice show up in another chart.
Right, here you've got another from Nowhere Brown, the Business of Brands article showing the share of voice leading to growth, it's a strong contributor. And then when we look at this data point, this is looking at advertising awards that are based on effectiveness and the factors that are contributing to effectiveness. And coming in at number one, which is much bigger than number two and so on, is brand size. And when we think back of all this, the largest brands have the easiest time of creating those memory associations. They're already present in their minds, so they already have these memory structures, and they're present on the grocery store shelves so that we see them throughout when we go about the world.
They cover up the trades, big wins, and big wins because the value of brand, how frequently you hear from somebody. They have the biggest budgets to power marketing, and that's what we saw in the Freakonomics study. They looked at large companies and they were putting noise into the marketplace to stay present in people's minds because they're trying to establish and keep a brand, because they realize that brand is what drives market share, the incremental growth that they might be able to achieve, and margin. And we see that here. Now, the question you should be asking is, how do I get there? So let's walk you through some examples of how other companies have gotten there and see what we can learn from them. So we go through 3 phases of startup business with our friends at Apple.
We previously talked about these different phases a little bit from the company perspective, but really this is about the mind of the customer that dictates which phase you're in. Because when you build that strong brand, then you have that instant affinity, and that's the thing that creates you into that next phase. So when you're at the startup phase, it's just blank. They don't really have a notion of who you are and an image of who you are. As you begin to grow, it's a little bit blurry, but it's starting to come in, that brand. And then when you've reached that mature phase, then you've got that solid definition of what the brand is in your mind.
And so as we think about phase of business, it's much more important to think about phase of business from the perspective of your consumers. What do they think about me? As opposed to any operational logistical place that you might be and saying, oh, we've got factories in 12 locations around the country. That's not nearly as important as what your consumers think you are. In fact, there's some great examples of companies like our friends at Tesla who have very little penetration in terms of actual sales, but mental share, they dominate. And as a result, they are worth more than the next 4 automakers combined, even though they dwarf them in sales. Now, how our friends at Apple got there. And I love some of the images you found here, including the very first Apple computer.
Yeah, this was a shocker to me. I kind of had to get multiple sources to confirm. But you can imagine that whoever was using this early Apple computer, it was a very small group of people, and they were very tied to what that actual product was. And when we look at how they advertise, it's also going to be, as Jake talked about, that kind of startup mentality approach to advertising. Here's a little article about them.
Hey, we sell computers. That has to be the message you get across in that early phase. Just let people know you exist, and it's very sales driven. And all of Apple's early sales involved Jobs and Wozniak and the crew going out and knocking on doors and saying, hey, buy some computers from me. But as they progressed, the structure changed. They began to get a little awareness, and they went into a growth phase. And during that growth phase, sure, it continued to be a little sales driven or very sales driven, but they realized to accelerate, they had to begin building a brand. And they began doing some things that at the time people thought were fairly controversial. Yeah,
the real turning point for Apple was in 1984 when they transitioned into that strong brand building and the mentality of the idea of the individual, the person. They transcended the product into something that was bigger. And here's a short clip of that.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created for the first time in all history a garden of pure ideology where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
It's easy to forget, back in 1984, Apple was tiny. IBM, who was the major computer manufacturer at the time, didn't even have them on their competition set. If you knew about Apple, it was kind of a surprise to most people. And the second tier companies in that space, like Microsoft, who made all the operating system, dominated. Apple was inconsequential, but they knew the value of branding. Even though it didn't pay dividends that year, it began paying dividends in every year thereafter. Until now, they're the most valuable company on the planet. All of their marketing is brand building. You cannot find any Apples that talk about sales events or retail type strategies. They don't depend on salespeople coming and knocking at your door. You seek them out. We go stand in lines in front of their stores, hoping that we can get one of their products on release day. This is what a mature brand looks like. And it's all driven by share of mind, that level of preference. And guess what? We pay a pretty big price premium to do business with Apple. The competition set is substantially more expensive or less expensive, and also has a lot greater features than Apple does. Although don't tell them I said that, I do love my Apple products. It's because they have convinced us that they are better through a share of mind. So we ignore any rational facts.
All the individuals who are aligned with the Apple brand have gone through a different process in terms of connecting with them. So some of them started out at the desktop phase, some got the iPod, some got a laptop, some got a phone, some it was Apple Music. It's all different, but the brand, the strong brand, helps unite them to make it cohesive across all these different complex touch points and mental associations that people have. And that's diving into, again, what makes it effective. So we're talking about the memory formations, but being conscientious about the memory formations and the memory structures that you're creating. Identifying the points where people begin to think about your product and your category and your brand, and how are you going to come into place so that they're the one that they decide to purchase at that moment.
It's probably a good point in the presentation as we enter into this next phase to remind everybody, as you have questions, put them in the chat function below, and we will begin tackling them at the end. Because as we begin to apply these concepts into what do I do with them, I hope you are thinking about your business and your brand. And the first major concept is this concept of entry points. We call them trigger points because we think about it in terms of a psychological construct, but it really has to do with when is somebody going to enter that tiny little window where they're thinking about my product or my category that my brand might become relevant. So we go through a process where we begin to be very rigorous about defining that. When, where, why, with whom, with what, so that we can define exactly what that trigger point looks like and define exactly what's going on psychologically, what's going through that person's brain very quickly so that my brand becomes relevant at that specific moment.
Yeah, let's take a look at a commercial that does a great job of doing this.
Did you steal my Cheetos again?
Just tell him it wasn't you.
But I caught you at the counter.
Wasn't me.
Saw you snacking on the sofa.
Wasn't me.
You even had him in the shower.
It wasn't me.
I even caught you on camera.
You the one who granted access to your snacks. Don't act surprised that she sneak behind your back. You gotta keep tabs before she empty that bag. Let's review the situation. Orange fingers, red flag. To keep you on stash, you gotta hide it better. If she asks where they are, you say forget her. Never admit to a word, and please don't upset her. And if she keep on snacking, I guess you let her.
Well, did you?
Wasn't me.
Oh. Okay.
Well, that's the first time that's ever worked.
New Cheetos Crunch Pop Mix.
Now, this spot has a lot of good stuff going on it. There's great audio mnemonics, there's celebrities, but the specific thing that I think that makes it effective is the use of trigger points. They've defined a specific instance that we can all relate to, that moment where we're snacking, kind of cheating, we don't want other people to know about it, and they're beginning to own that specific concept. And that can have a very powerful effect that can extend well beyond their own ads.
Yeah, here's an example of regular people using this and being reminded of this as they go about their day.
On today's episode of Literally Caught Red-Handed, we have the influencer who says eat the salad, sends the little people out of the room, and open, show, open. Don't make me do it, man, own it. Takes the chips and bloody hides them inside the drawer. Huh? Wasn't you, wasn't me. Huh? Caught you in the coffee snack drawer? Wasn't me. In the shower? Wasn't me. Who's banging on the bathroom floor now, bloody? Wasn't me.
Now, this is somebody taking the same concept and applying it in their own space. They're getting that amplification. And even though they weren't using the same product, it made us think about it. It made us think, oh, is that Cheetos? And recalls that memory. And that's the power of owning a trigger point, of inserting yourself into that moment when we're all cheating. And this can be done in a variety of ways. You can make up trigger points that you can own. For instance, one of our clients wanted an association for it being warm because their product is primarily available and does well during the summer months. So we created an association. When the sun's out, your tongue's out, because Rita's Italian Ice colors your tongue. And this association proved to be a surprisingly strong one and caught on with their fan base, who, after they ate Rita's, began taking selfies and Instagram pics with their tongue sticking out, which amplified the concept, which allowed us to own that trigger point. And trigger points can take a variety of different ways. Same brand, but what if we own the associations with Italy, for instance? So if you think about culture or trying something different, you associate it with Rita's. And you can do that with marketing. As you begin to think about famous Italian concepts, we can always associate Rita's. And this gives us a different trigger point that we might be able to insert our brand within. Because that's the construct. What's the trigger point, and what is the relevance of my product at that trigger point? Now, thinking about things in a very different way, perhaps you're trying to break into a new market space, such as becoming a refreshing drink post-workout. Well, you can do that by talking specifically that trigger point. Now, most people think about post-workout, let's have a Gatorade or other high sugar drink. But some of that audience just worked out. They don't want a high sugar drink, and this is an opportunity for unsweet tea. Refigure your refreshment. So we're defining a trigger point and inserting a product that will be relatable with a specific why you, in this case, no calorie, for that trigger point. And this is the same construct that most branding ought to have. Define a trigger point, insert yourself. And I want to show you how wildly effective this can be. You can take a brand or a product like we did with Mohawk that started from scratch. They were in startup phase. They had a new product. No one had ever heard about it. We did some research, and what we found is that the trigger point for moms was, how's this going to stand up to my kids and my pets? I bet they're going to destroy this. So if you can show me that it's going to stand up to my kids and pets, I'll give you a look. So we took that trigger point and we created a great example of how it would stand up. So we took it to several zoos, and we carpeted the animal enclosures at those zoos, and we turned the zoos into, or the animals into social media stars, and we did a big press tour to get this concept across. Well, within 9 months, Mohawk went from the startup phase to the mature phase, where they dominated market share within the subcategory of pets and children. They still maintain that dominance in that space because of this one concept that they continue to amplify. And that's the power of effective branding. You don't have to stay in phase one simply because you're working off sales. If you have an effective, highly creative idea, it can rocket you through several phases of business, because the phase of business is defined by your consumer psychology as opposed to what's going on in your own head. So as we think about those 3 phases of business growth, starting with the startup phase, moving into the growth phase, and ultimately into the mature phase, the entirety of the game is how fast can I get to the mature phase? To do this, we do it through building a brand as quickly as possible and talking to as many people as possible. Anybody that might ever do business with us, even in the broadest definition of circumstances. That allows us to grow the fastest, and it means the quality of our work gets us there faster. And that ultimately is the game. So as we think about that original Freakonomics research, we put it through that filter of what phase of growth you're in. We saw that the research really applied to mature phases of business. So don't panic. Marketing does work. It just works differently, and you have different goals. Make sure that your goals and strategies evolve based off of the phase of business you're in. The things that you did in phase 1 won't necessarily work the same in phase 2 and 3 as you enter the mature phase of business. So as you have that balance of brand and sales, you're going to look up one day and realize that you may have overinvested in sales and underinvested in brand. And we see this even in some businesses today. They look up and say, hey, my direct mail isn't as effective as it used to be. Leads are coming in without us prodding the marketplace. What's going on? And you begin to realize that a mature company builds because of the strength of its brand and diminishes some of those earlier sales activations. So how do we do that? Number 1, stay present, talk to everybody, be disciplined about building a brand by defining those trigger points and inserting yourself. And at the end of the day, it's about greater share of mind. We want people to think about us at that moment of trigger point by pre-programming the brain so that we are relevant at that moment that they begin to think about our category, which again is a tiny, tiny moment. Awesome. Guys, we have covered a whole lot of ground today. We're about to get to some questions, but beforehand, if you've liked today's content, go visit our website. We put out lots of additional content around the psychology of effective marketing. We also have regular content that we put out on YouTube and via email, including a weekly CMO Minute where we cover relevant current research and apply that to your marketplace. Now, if you don't want to go through any of that, just feel free to email me. I love getting email from people that want to talk about marketing. I'm a nerd myself, so feel free to shoot me questions if you don't want to cover it today. Happy to respond to you directly. Now, with all that said, I know we've had a few good questions pop up, so let's begin talking about those. So first question is, what about auto insurance? And I believe this originally popped up when we were talking about the size of the market. Should we still talk to a mass audience? David, the answer here is going to be what we thought it was earlier, right? Talk to as many people as possible.
Yeah, people's transitions through auto insurance can get pretty complicated. A lot of times we start off with the one that our parents had, then we get in a relationship and we think about the one we're in a relationship with. So we have a lot of life changes. And when we actually look at the pattern of the degree of purchasing and the number of purchases, it follows that same negative binomial distribution, even for auto insurance.
That's right. So I don't care what you sell to a mass audience. That's the goal, and you want to get there as quickly as possible, which leads us to the next question, which is we discuss about knowing our audience's mindset instead of relying on our own mindset, which is true. So how do we convince a sales team that research is needed to understand the consumer's mindset when they think they know 100% of the mindset? And I think you really hit at the heart of the issue with this question. The what got you here won't get you there. Most companies grew because of very effective sales organization. And at some point, somebody has to realize that's not what's going to get us to the next phase of business. It doesn't mean we won't have salespeople. Most companies continue to have salespeople throughout their entire life cycle. It just means that the focus must shift to a larger question of preference, which is a branding question. So you're asking a group whose existence depends on a different answer, how to change that answer. And it's a tough one. Typically, we go to the C-suite and we begin sharing some of this research to show you want to go to the next phase of business. It means building a brand, which means changing what we've been doing, relying less on salespeople and more on broad levels of awareness. Sometimes you will get salespeople that are forward thinking and can see the research, but at the end of the day, they will likely see this as a threat to their very existence. Just like the direct response folks in a company don't like it when a brand begins getting built often because they view it as a threat to their existence. So how you do it, it's a tough question.
We readily will accept brand awareness as a metric. So we'll say, okay, have you heard of this brand? Check the box. But we don't necessarily accept, does this brand associate with a sunny day? Do you associate this brand with Italy? And so you can track all these different metrics that align with people's behavior and how they go about their lives and their memory associations. See where you want to prioritize, lean in on the ones you want to prioritize, find the ones that will engage the largest audience and maybe a specific audience. And so you can be strategic about making sure that you stay top of mind in the right places.
So the next question I think is a logical follow-up to this, David. They want to know how you communicate this value of long-term brand building to executives when they want immediate ROI. They want to know what's going to be the return when we immediately spend something. And here's what I found. If you've made it to the C-suite, you're pretty smart and you don't mind seeing research. So we like to show the research so that people can understand conceptually how it gets there. Then it's okay to put out results metrics tied to brands, because brands aren't just a magic voodoo box where we begin spending some money and hope that one day we see results. You can tie metrics to that, including awareness and affinity and some other things that we know are directly related to sales. Now, it's not like a direct response activity or a sampling activity where you can measure next day sales. There is a lag in that growth. But if you are willing to look at that lag and show them the long-term ROI, you can show that over a period of time. And if you look at the successful companies, they got to be successful companies because they believe in this concept. They realize that building a brand, creating that large level of awareness, pairs with all the other difficult components of building a business, like having a great product and good distribution and reliability and quality of products and a good culture. Often brand is the one of those things because it's not tangible, they haven't learned about yet. So I do think you can show that. We didn't go in today to showing the math behind coming up with some of those metrics and how you can have those anchor weights to some of the branding outcomes to show the ROI, but they do exist. Just a lot more math is involved because they're not immediate. So another good question, does this concept of building a brand apply in the B2B space? Great question, David. What are your initial thoughts?
it's the same basically. There's minor differences, but it's a general pattern because at the end of the day, we are all people.
Yeah, and you're trying to get that share of mind. Same rules apply. We're still talking to people. They're still going through the same psychological process of decision making. And they are looking for simple answers to short questions in the tiny window that they're thinking about it. So no matter if you sell pipe to insurance products or anything else to a business, they're going to think about you for a tiny window. And so you want to pre-program their brain so that, oh, I know of this company and have a preference for this company before the question comes up. A lot of the studies we've looked at apply in the B2B space, and they come to the exact same conclusions. In fact, we cover a little bit of this in this week's CMO Minute. So check your email. If you're listening today, you probably got a copy of that. You'll see some of the research that applies in the B2B space, and not surprisingly, it's nearly identical to the B2C space. It's a great question. So got a good question about constrained budgets. This is actually my favorite because I haven't had the privilege of working with anybody that thinks they've got sufficient budgets yet. I don't know about you. I'm sure they're out there, but everybody is worried about getting the most for the least. And the answer here is to get broad reach as much as you can and to do things that enhance the quality of the creative product. Now, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it today, but the quality of the creative can help you amplify well beyond the quality of the media that you are getting so that you earn that buzz value so that people are talking about you outside of this medium. And that's really the game today, to get more effect than you get from just simply the media spend. If you rely solely on the media spend, sure, you can get there, but it'll be incremental growth. And I think that Mohawk example is a good one. Their media spend was relatively tiny, but the amplification from the earned media they got was tremendous. So focus on the quality of the creative idea so that it cements itself in when people see it, but can also earn beyond itself. And that's a great way to get more mileage out of your overall media strategy. We're going to talk about this some more because I know our creatives are going to want to get some webinar time. And we're going to talk about how to build creative concepts that earned share of keyboard, if you will, or share of voice outside of their own media. And that's a great metric to begin looking about. So great question from a franchisee. Does brand building apply to an individual franchisee, or should it be handled differently on a corporate level? And I would say the answer is depending on who you ask. If I'm at the corporate level and we work with a lot of franchise-based organizations, you get the most value from everybody combining together to build an overall brand. But that doesn't mean that marketing at a local store level doesn't have an effect. And we all are familiar with this concept. There's probably a chain restaurant where you have a preference for a local location, or a chain location where you've got to know the manager or the employees at a single location. You develop a preference for that. That still is branding. The net effect works best when you are working as a group, but you can still build a brand at a local level. You can still develop relationships within a community. You can be very important within the Birmingham market, as an example, if you're here in Birmingham and you own a location or a chain of locations within that market. And so branding can have an effect at a local store level. But in terms of that balancing act, you probably want to be a little bit more sales activation at the local level and allow that group to work on awareness level activities, that brand building, the mass marketing effects, because you do get economies of scale that are hard to replicate at a local level. And we see that in media. If I want to reach a national audience, it's much cheaper to buy a single piece of national media than it is to buy in the top 100 individual markets. It's dramatically more expensive to buy at that level. That's a simple answer to a relatively complex question. Well, guys, you have been tremendous. Thank you for your attention. I know we are covering a fairly complex topic. Again, send me your emails. I know you've got some other good questions. And if you're like me, as soon as we log off today, you're going to have some other great questions, or maybe in the shower in the morning when you're washing your hair and you're not thinking about anything, or you're like, oh, I wish I would have asked this, or that final piece of the puzzle will get into play. Let me know. I'd love to share your thoughts with some of the rest of the audience, and I'd love to talk about your business. We're going to wrap it up. We will have this, it has been recorded. We will post this tomorrow on our website, and you will get an email with a link to that if you want to watch this again. And look for our regular CMO minutes that will come out each and every week, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much for your time. We'll talk again soon.